There are tensions between different communities. There are also problems in the way questions of land have been handled in the past. There are also issues of militarization, especially the national media. Right? They have not paid enough attention to what's happening in the Northeast. They don't know much about the intricacies. It is possible that many of them can't even distinguish the different ethnic communities who inhabit and what are their sort of histories and relationships and so on and so forth. If there was sort of a tension brewing amongst those who participated in the rally, the intelligence should have known about it. Poverty in Manipur is very high. I've forgotten the exact figure, but it's a little less than 40% of the population who are below the poverty line in Manipur. That's a very, very high number, and it cuts across ethnic communities.
Normalcy still remains a distant dream, and violence hit Manipur, where over 60 people died after an influential students' body called a rally which turned violent, and violence unfolded across the state. But with life limping back to normalcy, with 11 districts of the state relaxing curfew measures, we are here to talk to Dr. Yengkhom of the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. So, Dr. Yengkhom, can we trace the origins of the violence? Do you think something different happened this time, or did old fault lines reopen?
The conflict, there is the immediate spark of the conflict that happened. As you pointed out, there was the protest rally, called the Solidarity Rally against the demand by the Métis for inclusion into this ST status. That is the immediate sort of spark that we know about. There is also, though, a longer history that we need to go back to. There are tensions between different communities. There are also problems in the way questions of land have been handled in the past. There are also issues of militarization that we need to address. Right? There's also been the issue of forests, protecting the forest areas that have been talked about. Issues of misuse of those forest areas for poppy plantation. So there are multiple issues, I think, that we need to focus on. So one is, as I said, the immediate issue, right? which is the rally called by Atsum. Right?
So, Dr. Yengkhom, we have many people have given different accounts of what happened, what transpired, what led to the extreme violence that resulted in so many deaths and several hundreds of houses burned down, including places of worship. So do you think the state government, to some extent, has to take the blame for failing to take matters into its own hand?
The law and order issue is definitely to be looked into. I think there was definitely an intelligence lapse. If there was sort of a tension brewing amongst those who participated in the rally, the intelligence should have known about it. We don't know. I mean, we already know that there was a tension, unrelated, of course, but the chief minister was to inaugurate in Churchandpur, and it was vandalized. So we know that there has been a tension brewing for some time. So in the midst of that, for the state forces not to have taken into consideration security measures would definitely mean that there was a lapse in maintaining law and order, right? So therefore, the state government has to also take responsibility for what it failed to do.
Now, one narrative that we have seen being pushed is that of cookies versus Métis and Christians versus Hindu. So, do you think the distinction of class somehow gets left behind when we discuss things with such a, we paint things with such a broad brush.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, it's a very important point that we need to talk about, right? Poverty in Manipur is very high. Manipur is actually, all over India, Manipur is actually one of the poorest countries, right? I've forgotten the exact figure, but it's a little less than 40% of the population who are below the poverty line in Manipur. That's a very, very high number. And it cuts across ethnic communities, right? So people don't have jobs, people don't have regular stable source of income. So question of people's livelihood is something that we need to take into consideration, right? Just to add one more point there, many people in the recent past as well as earlier keep talking about how development is concentrated in Imphal and read that as Meitei versus tribal issue, right? We need to remember that Imphal is actually, as we now know, Imphal is not just for the Meiteis. There is actually a substantial population of Meiteis, of course. There are the Manipuri Muslims. You also have the Nagas and the Kukis inhabiting Imphal. So development in Imphal does not translate into development for the Meiteis. And I think that's an important distinction that we need to make, right? The poor people across community lines have been suffering for a very long time in the state of Manipur. Yeah.
And touching on another hot topic, something that has been discussed, especially in the aftermath of the riots and vandalism, and that's is the NRC demand in Manipur for the majority Meitei community. So we have talked to, we here at EastMojo have talked to both Meiteis and we have talked to Kukis on the day of the rally. And this is an issue that has irked a lot of people. So do you think it is justified for the community, that is the majority in the state, to demand special rights and privileges?
Well, I don't know what you mean by special rights and privileges. What they are demanding is, and just to clarify, I'm not speaking as a Meitei voice, right? There are different voices out there, and it's good actually, even though many people would say that there are a lot of factionalism, it's actually a sign of democracy. On the demand for the inclusion of the Meiteis in the scheduled tribe list, if you go back a few years, you would notice that, there are voices amongst the Meiteis who have said that we don't have to have this, right? So there are different voices. There is not one singular Meitei voice that we need to keep in mind, right? But there are genuine issues that the people who are living in the valley are facing. And one of the most important issues, in addition to that of poverty, is that of land, right? If you look at the population density in the valley areas, especially in districts like Imphal, both east and the west, it's very high, right? At the moment, it's somewhere above 900 persons per square kilometer. So that puts a lot of pressure especially for the poor people, right? So how do we deal, in order to address this paucity of land is something that we need to think about very seriously, right? So there could be different measures, right? The demand for ST could be one of those, right? But there could also be other provisions, I'm sure, that we could think about, right? So to repeat myself, there is no one singular voice. There are differences, right? And it's a democratic country, so those differences should be sorted out in dialogue and debate.
And there is a third community that doesn't get talked about as much. So Nagas in Manipur, they inhabit a large portion of the hill areas. And this conflict somehow, and of course, hundreds of them have been evacuated by the Chief Minister Nefurio-led government over the past few days. So how do you think the conflict in the hills and now even the plains affects the Naga community, the large Naga community living in Manipur?
I mean, of course, people who are reporting from the ground would know better, but what we do know is that the Nagas have not been affected, at least they have not been physically harmed. There has not been any instances, as far as I know, of their properties and other belongings being affected. Right? There is, of course, fear. Right? Fear, which is not fear felt not just by the Nagas, but even people from Meghalaya, that they had to, they had to evacuate the students who are in Manipur. So this, in a way, challenges some of the theories being propagated that this is a conflict between a dominant community, i.e. Meiteis, and the tribals. Naga is a tribal community, but they are not affected at all. This also goes against another theory which says that it's a conflict between the Hindus and Christians, right? Because the Nagas are Christians and are not affected at all. So which means that there is something specific which is happening between the Meiteis and the Kukis in this case. And I think we need to look into that specificity, that that these generalized commonsensical understandings do not tell us anything of why this conflict has happened.
And then there's another aspect to it, like 60 people killed in a span of 3 or 4 days in violence across at least 11 districts of Manipur. So now life has to start going back to normal. It has already started limping back to normal, but it has to go back to normal at some point of time. So how do you think the communities will start trusting each other again, since they have to coexist in the same state going forward?
They have been coexisting. We must remember that these communities have coexisted for a very long time, for centuries, if not millennia. Right? So the first thing that we should be doing is to call for a cessation of the violence. Right? Whoever is involved in the violence, we must work against them and say that what we need right now is to call for peace, right? Which also means that not just people on the ground, right, but people who speak in the name of the communities have to realize that this blame game of who started it, whose dead bodies are more than the other, who has affected more, this sort of who is a deserving victim, that kind of a narrative has to stop. Right? We have to say that, and we have to come together and say that there are issues, right? There are issues that need to be addressed, and that those issues have to be addressed in a peaceful, dialogic manner. That violence is not a solution to any problem, and that, I think, is the starting point. The immediate call should be that we call for peace, right? And from there, we can then begin to, different interventions, intercommunity, to establish intercommunity relations, as it was the case earlier. That we have to work towards.
And now moving on to one of the more interesting aspects of the violence in Manipur, the coverage in media. There have been allegations and counter-allegations that media sides have been favoring one side or the other. There have been allegations that some communal statements have been made by media. So what do you think of the coverage of the events? What do you think of the coverage of the events in media, in both national as well as regional media? So do you think there's something could have been done better? Or do you think that people are right to get angry at some of the reports that were doing the rounds, some of the media reports?
This is an older problem, as you know, right? Older problem in the sense that especially the national media, right? They have not paid enough attention to what's happening in the Northeast. They don't know much about the intricacies. It is possible that many of them can't even, distinguish the different ethnic communities who inhabit and what are their sort of histories and relationships and so on and so forth. So it's a blind spot for the national media. They don't invest good reporters who should be reporting from the ground It is only when a crisis happens that they parachute these journalists from somewhere else who may have absolutely no idea of what's happening there. So if there are biases, those are not necessarily, I feel, intentional, but it's just out of ignorance, right? Because they do not know the place and the people and their histories, they're bound to make mistakes, right? And there are no two ways about it. The only way for us to correct that are the two ways. One, for the national media to take cognizance of what's happening in the region and invest a little more in terms of recruiting and training young reporters from the region, or at least people who know the region well. And also the local media, the regional media, also, there has to be a viable way for them to survive, right? In the changing context, it's becoming, I know, I have a lot of friends in the media fraternity, I know that it's very difficult for them to survive, doing vernacular journalism, right? So we need to look into both of those aspects.
And from a personal standpoint, you as a Manipuri person living in Assam, how do these incidents taking place in the hills and the valleys of Manipur affect you on a personal level? Do you feel any sort of trauma from all of this?
No, I wouldn't call it trauma, but I have my family members living there. It's very tense, there's no doubt about that, right? So I can tell two stories. One is that I can tell the suffering of the people that I know, and they're very tense in the village. In my village, people are still very tense. People are not sleeping properly. They don't sleep at home. They're sleeping outside. Women and children are affected. They have to be shifted out of their homes, and they're not sleeping at night, and so on and so forth. So I can tell either that story and blame the other, or I can tell a story which calls for peace, and I choose the latter, right? That I know that people are affected. Everyone knows that people are affected. I think what we need to do right now is come above that animosity, especially responsible citizens, especially for those who are residing outside the state, that we must not be adding fuel to the fire. We need to stand and say that we do not support violence. Whichever group, whichever community is engaging in that violence, we need to call them out and say that we are against violence, that we should work towards a peaceful society wherein different communities can coexist together.
So there we have it, a very interesting and interesting conversation with Dr. Yengkhom, who is a professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Guwahati. He disavowed violence and called for peace and unity in these troubling times. And here at EastMojo, we want to make one thing very clear. We'll bring you all sides of the story, and we'll try to get to the absolute bottom of what caused these terrible events to transpire in the first place. So this is me, Rana Pratap Saikia, with camera person Mukut Medhi, signing out from EastMojo.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to EastMojo. For any queries, put them down in the comments section below and press on the bell icon for notifications.